My name is James, and I'm here to introduce our presenter this afternoon. And our presenter this afternoon is Mekki MacAulay, and our topic is, as you can see on the screen there, using art to visualize the stories of Canadian organizations that contribute to Firefox development. Mekki is a PhD candidate in strategic management, open source strategy research specialty at the Schulich School of Business, York University. His research focuses on bringing contemporary management theory with open source research in practice. His teaching focuses on strategy in the modern enterprise with open source strategies as an increasingly recognized approach. He holds an undergraduate degrees from Carleton University in Computer Systems Engineering and Psychology, and a master's degree in Technology Innovation Management. He is a licensed professional engineer in the province of Ontario. Mekki is the founder of osstrategy.org, a strategic management consulting firm that helps companies improve their business models and strategic planning in a world that is embracing FSOSS tools and methods. So I have the pleasure to present to you a scholar, a researcher, an entrepreneur, and a practitioner, Mekki MacAulay.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. I promise next year to submit a smaller profile. Sorry about that. If you want to follow along these slides, I gave a preliminary presentation on this stuff last year at FSOSS, and if you look at the bottom of the slide there, those slides are available at osstrategy.org/FSOSS 2014, or the current one, 2015, in your choice of formats. The content of all these slides are licensed as CC BY, so feel free to do whatever you'd like with them. You can find me on Twitter at Mekki, and my website, mekki.ca, because I talk way too fast, and let's have better conversations later on that aren't in this format. So this is part 2 of my doctoral research. I was originally motivated by the frustrations many engineers face with management people telling us, no, open source isn't a viable business model. That's ridiculous. We need to close everything down or we can't make any money. And I said, that's stupid, so I'm going to go do a PhD and prove you wrong. And the way I'm doing that right now is I'm analyzing Mozilla's Bugzilla database and trying to find some interesting insights about how we can understand organizational level participation in open source. So some of the findings are coming out of that right now are on the Canadian side of things, and then stay tuned for next year where I'll do a global take on that. And some interesting stuff there. So to do this research, I use R. R is a common statistical analysis tool that shows up at universities everywhere that's displacing the really expensive statistical analysis packages, which is hilarious, of course. You know, research on open source has to be done with an open source statistical tool. So along the way, you'll note that absolutely everything in this presentation was created in R, and the code that is used to generate everything in this presentation, I posted on GitHub, and it's licensed as GPL3. So you can find me on GitHub under username Mekki M. And you are welcome to take this code, not embarrass me for how terribly written it is, and fork it and improve it and do all those wonderful things. Very soon there will be a new branch that has the wider analysis beyond Canada showing up in this GitHub analysis location, and I'd love to participate with you, to work with you, to get some more interesting insights out of Bugzilla. That's how we got here. First, some acknowledgements. Lots of people have supported this research. York University, Schulich School of Business, Ontario Ministry of Training, colleges and universities with their grants. Of course, thank you Mozilla for giving me access to your Bugzilla database in raw form. A huge 8 gigabyte CSV dump, essentially. It's delightful, the analysis you can do with that. And finally, lastly, I want to thank CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, and their community investment program. They gave gave me a sizable grant for this portion for the research. So thank you very much for that. And in particular, I'd like to thank Jenna Feldman, who's the manager of community relations at CIRA, who did a wonderful job of supporting many open source projects. They've been supporting Mozilla as well, some other projects. So thank you to CIRA, much appreciated. Incidentally, they're taking applications for next year's grants. If you're interested, look into the Community Investment Program grants. So what's going on with R? I've mentioned some of it. It's been slowly displacing other statistical packages since about 2000, and now it's pretty much the de facto standard for analysis. So it's a great example of an open source community that has exploded. It's largely developed by and maintained by academics who wanted control that didn't involve having to go to SPSS or SAS and say, hey, can you please add this feature every time a new statistical process was developed? And you wouldn't think there have been advances in statistics over the past 30 years, but that's completely untrue. In fact, there have been huge advances and they're continuing. So it allows them to create better statistical analysis tools faster than the commercial off-the-shelf model. And it being free, it makes it really easy because universities are notoriously bad for their procurement departments, just like government. So a lot less headache for academics who want to do analysis. So you can poke around on CRN, the Comprehensive R Archive Network, and see what's going on there. There are literally thousands of add-on packages to do pretty much anything you would like. And if you look in the comments of my code, I list all the packages that I use for this particular analysis. But you could, as Larry Wall likes to say, Tim Toady, you can do it many different ways. There are lots of redundant packages, and that's deliberate so that you can choose the approach that you're most comfortable with. So you see the graph on the right there that R has just exploded in popularity, and all the statistical software vendors are freaking out and trying to figure out how to do open source business models. So yay, question mark? The GitHub repository, I mentioned, everything's licensed as GPL3, and there are extensive comments, particularly because my code is so terrible. So I compensate for that by having extensive comments. So you should be able to figure out what's going on just from reading my comments, and then you can laugh at how poorly it's done, and you can improve it. So expect future branches at that location. Why am I looking at Canada? The obvious reason is because it fits with the CIRA mandate. But the less obvious reason is that we lost Silicon Valley North after the 2001 crash and Nortel fell apart and everything in Ottawa. And you know what? Waterloo's not looking so healthy these days with RIM either. So there's sort of a desire in Canada to figure out what's really going on in terms of internet innovation. There's a belief that the internet economy will contribute a huge amount in the Canadian GDP over the next few years, but nobody really knows how or why. So that's why I'm looking at Canada with this research, because it's particularly relevant to a lot of the funding agencies and innovation policy in Canada, and of course, educational institutions. Why look at Firefox? I don't really need to explain that to this audience. Everybody knows why. It's because it's awesome. It beat Microsoft at the game of trying to take over the internet back in the early days, but now it's kind of waning. Firefox usage share is waning, and that's a little bit panicky for those of us who care about the open web. So understanding why and how that's happening and how we can get organizations who have money to help turn that around, I think is really important. Plus, Toronto, big office, lots of people like beer. That personal connection is worth a lot. Beer is such a currency in open source, let me tell you. It's not just a Linux kernel joke. Buy people beers, you'd be amazed at what you come up with. So access to the database was a really good reason too. So let's jump in. Graph number 1. What does Bugzilla look like on the Canadian perspective? So this is a hastily drawn and probably difficult to visualize, maybe you can see it on your own laptops a little bit better, of all the different organizations who contribute to Bugzilla in Canada. So how did I come up with that? There's a field in Bugzilla, which incidentally, I should mention, if anybody wants to take this on, Bugzilla doesn't have a proper schema that's up to date. So trying to figure out what fields do what, Josh pointed out earlier, is not exactly trivial. So there's a field called login name in the profiles table, which is essentially an email address. And through some interesting code, I was able to split up the portions of the email address and aggregate them around all the ones that end in .ca. So that actually creates a very conservative subset of the people who are involved in Canada. Obviously, lots of people in Canada are contributing with Gmail and Hotmail addresses, but there's no way for me to identify them because that data is simply not in the database. But with this conservative sample, I was still able to find really, really cool things. So it's worth looking at that. So that's how I came up with this list. I identified approximately 6,000 different organizational users that in this small subset contribute from .ca, from a Canadian context. And I was able to reduce that to approximately 1,400 organizations involved in Canada. There's some magic I had to do to eliminate all the webmail, Hotmail, Gmail, that kind of stuff, addresses that had .ca extensions, Rogers ISP emails and all that stuff. It's really ugly. It's even uglier in the next branch that's going to come up, but it works. And so we have a very, very conservative subset that we can be sure, as much as we can, is Canadian and Canadian organizations, although obviously there's a lot more. So this is what it looks like. And no surprise, it's not even at all. Different organizations contribute different amounts. So this is the count of number of registered users with that particular .ca domain portion. Once you strip off everything ahead of that, in front of the @ symbol and in front of subdomains and all that, this is what it looks like. So in the top left, we see University of Toronto and a bunch of other people there, and then you see it tapers off into a really, really, really long tail. So suddenly we have a visual of the long tail effect in Bugzilla in Canada. That's pretty cool. I don't know about you guys, but I've never seen that before. And that really excited me when I first generated this graph. I'm like, yes, we can see the long tail effect of open source contribution in Canada. That's cool. So then I wanted to mess around with that. So R has an internal graphing language that is essentially its own sub-language inside of R. It's a library called ggplot2, which is an absolutely terrible name for a graphing library, but it's extremely powerful. And it allows you to manipulate data tables, multi-dimensional data tables, in all kinds of interesting ways to generate these graphs. So all of these graphs are generated from the same data, but using different intersections of tables, different ways of representing the data, adding variables like time or various forms of aggregation and so on. And that's part of the power of the graphing language in R. If you dig through the source code, you can see what that looks like. And my comments explain sort of what's going on, because my comments were me learning how to do it as I was going. So some of the comments are really dumb because I'm excited about this little thing that a regular R user would be like, that's obvious, you know. But if you're starting up, it'll be helpful to read my comments there. So here I split them into groups. And we have on the left, we have universities. And then the green, we have colleges. The marine, aquamarine, whatever that is, we have federal government. And then the purple is other. That's the long tail. That gives us a little bit of information about how they're distributed, but it doesn't tell us a whole lot. So let's try a different view. Let's use the facilities in R to split up the individual lines within those graphs and overlay the names of those sources. It looks really ugly when there's 1,400 organizations in here, but you can already see some contrast to those columns. So clearly, the right-hand column is the long tail. It's not really one organization doing a lot, except maybe that big blue and off red blob in the middle there. We can see better what's going on. But the scale is terrible. It's really hard to see. So let's adjust the scale and knock off all that long tail that's the other. And let's see what's going on with universities, colleges, and federal government. We see that the universities are dominated by a few larger number of users in the universities in the green at the bottom there. We see in colleges a giant purple square there that represents the college that is making the most contributions in Canada. You want to take a guess? Who wants to take a guess about what color purple is? It's in the legend if you can squint. Seneca College, no surprise there. Seneca College is in fact eclipsing all the other colleges, and we can suddenly see that in a nice big purple square that compares it to the other users in Bugzilla. And then we see something going on in a few federal government departments in there, but we're still not seeing a lot. So let's try to understand a little bit more before we generate the next graphs. So I talked to a lot of people. I talked to people at universities, I talked to people at colleges, I talked to people at Mozilla and in open source organizations, and I interviewed them and I transcribed their interviews and I did all kinds of academic-y stuff. And what I learned is that universities are not all the same. You have these top-tier universities who have a reputation effect over 100 years, and for them, open source is sort of like, yeah, academic freedom, this is cool, we're gonna do this thing, we have tenure, you know, what, let's do this. And then you have the smaller universities who are essentially like, we gotta catch up to the big universities, so let's only do the things that count towards the metrics that give us better rankings. Open source, nah, nobody measures that for university rankings. Why would you do that? So what you actually see in the smaller universities is a few professors on the side who are doing sort of skunk work projects because they understand that this is important research, but that it's not really a strategy of those universities because it doesn't contribute to the metrics of what makes them great universities. They all want to be U of T and Waterloo, right? So incidentally, York fits that pattern. I'm not bitter at all, clearly. So we're understanding a little bit more about what's going on inside of universities. That tells us something. So let's look more closely just at the universities. So on the left side of the graph there, you see University of Waterloo, you see University of Toronto, you see UBC, Simon Fraser University seem to have the most users, and then it tapers off gradually for the rest of Canadian universities. You'll also note that we've added on the right side there an index to see what's going on, and the graphing language allows you to play around with that a lot. You can use auto-generated colors, you can play around with the colors, you can put indexes, not indexes. It pulls that all automatically out of your data set, so you don't have to manually write this. There is no post-processing in this graph. This is directly what comes out of R, which is kind of cool because otherwise you have to manipulate it and you have to do stuff afterwards, and it makes it easier to visualize data quickly. But users, that's only one way to count contributions, right? I mean, you can have a lot of users who aren't doing much. So let's add in a time variable and let's see what they're doing in terms of bug reports. Suddenly the picture looks very different. We see McGill, who doesn't show up with a lot of users, actually being the first to be really involved in contributing, and they were contributing as early as 2002. So this data set starts from the beginning of Mozilla in 1998 to the end of 2012. So I don't have any data after the end of 2012, but we do have a 14-year window there, which is pretty cool. So we see McGill was involved really, really early on, and then they dropped off the face of the earth. They stopped doing it. So you got, again, an interesting question there, but what was McGill getting out of it in 2002 that they're not getting out of it in 2015? So when we're talking about ways of onboarding people to contribute to projects, understanding the organizational level motivations is suddenly really important, especially when someone had mentioned in the last presentation how much universities and colleges are contributing to open source projects. So why isn't McGill involved anymore? I think that's a really interesting question. And this visualization tells us exactly the time frame in which that happened. Did a professor move to another university and nobody followed up, or what's going on there? That's pretty cool. We also see that the University of Toronto started getting really involved around 2004, and then it tapered off a lot. And then Waterloo, shockingly, you wouldn't think this, only really sort of starts to spike around 2011. You would think Waterloo would have had really big early involvement. And so maybe an interesting question is who's at Mozilla right now who was previously at University of Waterloo and might have done stuff when they were there? That's an interesting question. So we see these various different patterns over time that we can identify and get a better sense. So again, bug reports, it's only one measure. What about activities? Activities are kind of different. Activities is assigning and changing statuses and prioritizing a lot of the things that Josh was talking about in his presentation. Who's doing the most activities? Turns out that the University of Toronto does a lot of that. So maybe they're a bit of a gatekeeper for some Mozilla communities because they do a lot of the activities moving around, even though maybe they don't necessarily submit the most bugs. That's interesting. Why? Why University of Toronto? Why no one else? Good question. So that's something to look into. And again, we see University of Waterloo doing a bit more of that in 2011. But the skew is very different here. in terms of activity. So that gives us a sense of what they're getting out of their participation and why they're doing it. What about colleges? Well, we know Seneca is involved, but how does that compare to universities? What we see in the past 20 years in Canada is that the colleges are playing a bit of a sort of a catch-up game. The past 10 years, government funding has actually drastically increased for colleges. The Harper government really wanted to improve funding to trades, and that kind of sort of not pie in the sky view of education, which politicians tend to think is university. It's not necessarily true, but that's what the political environment was. And so we see colleges who are now in a position to close the gap with universities. They're now allowed to introduce bachelor's programs. They're allowed to hire people who have PhDs and offer their own bachelor's in some cases, or sometimes in partnerships with universities. They're getting much more funding, and sometimes they're turning into universities. So not too long ago, Ryerson was a college. Then it became a university. So there's incentive both nationally and internationally for the colleges to play catch up to the universities. And to do that, they have to absolutely coin themselves in a unique area. And it's no surprise that Seneca has coined around open source. We know that. Right up to David Agnew's level, the president, open source and technology and those areas have been a focus of Seneca. What are the other colleges doing? Well, we don't see that in the Bugzilla database because it's not open source. But for example, if you ask around, Sheridan's focusing more on 3D animation. Loyalist is focusing more on things like security, infrastructure, that kind of stuff. Out west, the colleges are focusing more on mining, that kind of specialty. And so you get the different sort of colleges with their brands and how they're involved there. So again, Seneca has a lot of users. Are they doing a lot of bug reports over time? Absolutely. They started doing it massively around 2003. We should see when David Humphreys first started at Seneca. That might be an interesting measure as well. And we see that they maintained it throughout. Some other colleges came and went and were involved, but by and large, Seneca is eclipsing everything. For activities as well, we see a huge bump in activities around 2008. What happened in 2008 with Mozilla and Seneca? Anybody know? Chris, no pressure. It's the CDOT ramp up, largely. It's not all 2008, but you can actually see in Bugzilla the formalization of CDOT and ramping it up and it getting more funding and so on and so forth. It wasn't just in 2008, but that's when it really became a bit of an explosion. And we see it's continued over time. Before that, it was around, but it wasn't sort of the focus. You didn't have these courses. I think David first offered his Mozilla course in 2008. Is that right? Around that time? In that ballpark, certainly. So we see that surge in the Mozilla database. And we see the other colleges aren't doing very much. Okay, so Seneca's awesome. We know that. But what about compared to universities? How do they scale? Well, turns out Seneca is actually kicking the butt of universities quite a bit. With the exception of the University of Toronto and Waterloo, they're very, very high in the university rankings for a lot of things, and with much smaller size. So think of how many students there are at the University of Toronto in the computer science department and in Waterloo. So percentage number of users of Seneca students versus percentage of U of T or Waterloo students is way, 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 way higher. That's amazing. No, not in anywhere in recent history have you seen colleges be able to eclipse universities of 102, 300-year-old stature on an area of specialty. So Seneca is really unique in that respect. You see Sheridan's down there as well. It's doing a few things, but it's not huge yet. What about activities? Ooh, I went backwards. Sorry. What about bug reports? Seneca's absolutely holding its own. It's right up there in the top with the bug reports, and it's consistent over time. There are certainly spikes, but it's always there. You see consistent activity from Seneca relative to the universities. What about activities? Oh my goodness, remember we said U of T had a lot of gatekeeping and was doing a lot of the activity management? Turns out that it's less than 1/3 of what Seneca is doing. Seneca is a huge gatekeeper in Mozilla communities, and you can see that clearly in this graph, totally eclipsing the other universities in terms of control of what's going on in the directions of the Mozilla projects. Wow! And you know, we can hypothesize about that, but now we have the data and the pretty graphs that you can put on the plasters of the Seneca-Mozilla partnership and say, look, we're making U of T and Waterloo, embarrassed. That's amazing. That's really cool. What about following? So following is when you follow another user in Bugzilla so that you get notified of whatever they're involved in, you get bug mail, and you can get a sense of what's going on with that. So that's sort of a measure of how much do you care about what anybody but you is doing. That's a really interesting measure. Turns out U of T, Waterloo, and most of the universities don't really care that much about what anybody but themselves are doing, except Seneca. Seneca is paying a lot of attention to what people are doing that are not at Seneca and involved in that broader sense. So that gives you insight again about the strategy. The universities are navel-gazing a little bit and saying, yeah, we're doing this cool research project, I'm tenured, la, 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 la. And Seneca's going, yeah, that's great, but what's going on over here? What's going on over here? How can I help here? That's really cool again. What about votes? So we see that some universities suddenly drop up and are voting for bugs more than others. Apparently the University of Saskatchewan has a bug up its bum, on a particular bug or a particular set of bugs because it has a lot of votes in there. But you don't see them with a lot of users or activities or bug contributions. So they're sort of saying, hey, do stuff for us, but we're not really going to contribute via any other means. That's really interesting too. They don't show up anywhere else. Seneca, about the same level as University of Toronto and Waterloo. So there's involvement, but there isn't sort of this offset demand. Yeah.
If I understand your labeling on the left, these are very small numbers. Are they actually significant in the real sense?
Very good question. I will answer that later in the presentation. Disclaimer, I am absolutely building a story around this in storytelling, no question. I justify that two ways. One, it's interesting, and that's really important. Two, I have a lot of qualitative data that doesn't show up here. And so the qualitative data is independent of the numbers, and I'm paraphrasing 2 or 3 years worth of research and talking with people that I can't justify on this slide, but that I believe that this narrative is true. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a lot, but we will do a quantitative analysis and significance. That's a very, very good point. Patches. Who's contributing patches? Boom, Seneca. Pretty much no one else is contributing patches. Wow, that's huge. Is that significant? Absolutely. So, we have 41 patches contributed in 2008 for Seneca. Wow. So again, that's around the C dot formation, starting to do big stuff there. Probably David Humphreys can be credited with that. That's really interesting. So I did this organization level, not individual level, and that's deliberate so that we can aggregate that. Yes?
Some of the things that I hear about at this conference sound like big changes. You're measuring the number of changes. Does it make sense to have a slide on lines of change?
It absolutely does make sense. Bugzilla doesn't track that. So there's actually a separate database that tracks the actual code itself. And there's a study out of the University of Waterloo where they tried to link up what goes on in the Bugzilla database with this code database, and they found that they can't do it. They can't line up the two because they weren't written with cross-linking in mind. And so if you try to link that up, the fuzziness of the poor linking overlays any useful data. And that sucks, and that's something we want to improve. But these systems weren't built with researchers in mind. So caveat, there are obvious limitations to what I'm talking about, and not understanding relative size of the patches is absolutely one. Look at phase 2 of the branch. I do have measures of patch sizes. So that's a lot more interesting, but it's slightly different. It doesn't use that external database. It's out of scope for today's presentation.
I will say you didn't plant me.
What about comments? We see some distribution of comments. Again, Seneca very involved. University of Toronto was involved a lot more early on, and then that tapered off. University of Waterloo a lot more recently. That's really interesting as well. So what's next for Seneca? Well, maybe someday we'll have Seneca University. Seneca already has 7 campuses and a number of partnerships. How much would it take to become the next Ryerson of Canada and build into university status? Certainly in terms of open source, it's at that level and it's able to make that argument. But there's more than that. There's joint bachelor programs in progress. There's a big partnership with India and a big partnership with China that's going on with Seneca. I don't know if you guys know about this. They're bringing in massive loads of students, and hopefully they will learn from all the mistakes they made with the Brazil partnership over the past 5 years, which fell apart. So hopefully that will go a lot better. But that's great for open source as well, because we see, especially at Mozilla, a lot of non-North American centric advances. So India, China, South America, those are really important markets. And having students who are educated in world-class open source development at Seneca from those geographies can both contribute to open source communities while they're here and when they go back home. In terms of things like translations and regionalizations is only the start. Then you have how they build up their local communities. So for example, one of my friends, Marcus, who was here a few years ago, he went back home and now he runs the Mozilla Brazil activities. And you have this community in Sao Paulo that's growing and that's doing development over there. And I sit on their IRC channel and I have no idea what's going on, and it's awesome. So that's the kind of stuff that we can see happening coming out of Seneca. It's really cool. Can other colleges imitate what they're doing? Well, we saw that there's a time lag effect. So Seneca has been ramping up for a long time. Can other colleges or even other universities just jump into this overnight? I would think not. I think it would take a couple of years to catch up. That's a competitive advantage that Seneca can really leverage. So, I wish we had more executive level people from Seneca here so I can be like, give CDOT more money. They're like totally pushing your university, but that's another matter. All right, let's jump ship now. Federal government. What's going on with the federal government, guys? So I did interviews with a number of federal government guys, and it turns out it's about avoiding bureaucracy. That's their involvement in open source. So here's a lovely quote from one of the interviews that I did with a government employee. And the person basically says that at government, and you guys might know this if you worked in government, there's a huge culture of pressure to not collaborate with your colleagues who aren't in your direct reporting structure. And that's the most ridiculous thing in the world, but that's your government at pretty much every level in Canada. And it happens at universities too. And so open source is an interesting way of building trust and collaboration to get around those social constraints. There are groups that have beer after hours where nobody can say, no, you're not allowed doing that during government time, who talk about their government projects and how they can collaborate together on the clock so that they can, not reinvent the wheel 2 offices over because people aren't paying attention to what's going on. And that's changing, but this has been a big problem. So that's where we see a lot of involvement. A second big problem is what I like to call the vendor problem. And for any of you who have worked in large government-esque organizations, you know that most of the business deals are the result of golf courses, not technical courses. And this is not a joke. This is a real thing. I mean, it's a joke, but it's a real joke, and especially happens in government. And the technical people who know the most about what's going on, the engineers, the computer scientists in government, are not invited to the golf courses. And so they have to deal with managers who often don't have a technical background, who get wined and dined by executives of commercial off-the-shelf companies saying, this is how it's done in industry. And they come back and they tell their engineers, you're stupid, this is how it's done in industry, please make sure that we buy this expensive project. And the engineers say, that's not how it's done in industry, it's done this way, and the executives laugh at them and say, do you want to still have a job? And that's, again, a real thing that happens in these organizations. So this particular person that I interviewed, who's a government employee, found a solution. He actually worked with the open source community to push through all of the fixes that were needed for the commercial off-the-shelf product that they were forced to buy to actually work, because it didn't even work. And they could not convince the company that they paid tens of thousands of dollars to actually patch it. Because, just because you give somebody money doesn't mean they're actually going to work for you in government. So he pushed all of the necessary patches into the open source community, and then guess what happened? The commercial company went, stole all the patches from the open source community, put it into their closed product, and added 3 lines on their marketing page saying, now supports this, now supports this. And suddenly, they could actually get a patch to get their expensive product to work. This is a real thing that happens. If that's not a sign that open source in government is like the most desperately needed thing, I don't know what is. So the involvement that we can see in Bugzilla is in this context. It's around trying to deal with isolating social structures, and vendors having ridiculous amounts of power over the purse strings of what goes on. So the US government actually very recently announced that it's going to do a trial program with open source procurement, by which it means if you procure open source products at less than $3,000, you don't have to go through the 18-month committee, 18 copy process bullshit to get what is essentially a free product. So they're going to trial this, and everybody's like, hallelujah, welcome to like 1996. But that's actually a huge recognition, because the US government is in fact the largest user of open source as an organizational entity in the world. Do you know which department? Defense, that's right. So the guys controlling the purse strings have been ignoring the fact that defense has been doing this for 15 years and are now saying, oh, we're going to trial it. But it's hilarious because it's sort of this tacit recognition that they've been screwing the pooch for so long that we're hoping that it's going to be sort of a move towards change. In Canada, ha ha! But let's take a look at what it looks like in Canada. So this is it. Who are the government departments that are contributing to Bugzilla? So we see in the top left there, Environment Canada and National Research Council are actually two of the top contributors. Do any of you have friends who worked at Environment Canada? Yeah? Do they still have jobs after Harper? That's not a joke, right? So some of the departments that were doing the most important work in open source to actually, deliver on their mandate got decimated by the recent governments who are just like, nah, we don't care about this science stuff. NRC, you've seen churn through retirements. Some of the most brilliant minds in Canada worked at NRC over the past 30 years, advancing the internet in ways people have never heard of. And those people are retiring and they're not being replaced. But while they were around, they did a lot of interesting stuff. So that's where a lot of these users come from. You then see a little bit of Public Works, a little bit of Health Canada, a little bit of Industry Canada. Okay, users. What about bug reports? Bug reports are actually incredibly temporal. So you see bug reports from Industry Canada, Public Works, and RCMP up to 2006, and then you see absolutely nothing between 2006 and 2010. What happened between 2006 and 2010 in the Canadian federal government? Does anybody know? Harper, but more specifically. What's that? A minority government, that is exactly correct. What does a minority government mean in government organizations? It means you cannot do anything, period, full stop, because we do not know if tomorrow the government will be dissolved and all the funding you were promised suddenly magically disappears. And we were in that state in Canada for 4 years. I happened to be working at Elections Canada for 3 of those 4 years, and so I might have a few scars about that personally. But that's exactly it. There was a complete hold on everything related to IT government-wide because it was viewed as a cost center. And they said, tomorrow we might lose all of our funding. What do we do?
Again, the number on the left seems to say those are one. So my own domain would beat the government.
You are absolutely right. We'll get there.
I don't know my domain.
I can guess. I think you're later on a future graph.
I'm not .ca.
Okay, then maybe not. But you'll see other similar users. So you're absolutely right. Bug reports is only one. It's a small measure. The story that I'm telling is based on personal experience that I'm dramatizing far beyond the data that's presented there. You're right. But trust me, this happened. This crush in IT happened between 2006 and 2010. Maybe it doesn't actually explain this graph, but it explains the context of where these bug reports were taking place. Activities. Whoops. Activities. We see that RCMP was heavily involved early on, and then later on we see only Environment Canada and NRC. No one else is really that involved. Interesting. Patches. RCMP. Pretty much nobody else. And again, the numbers are very small, so we only see 4 patches in 2006. What was the RCMP patching in 2006 in Mozilla, in Firefox? That's a really interesting question. What happened to the RCMP after 2006? Do you remember? The RCMP commissioner resigned in massive scandal, and the RCMP has been basically falling apart since, including especially their IT departments and what they were doing behind the scenes. And they have a big fight with CSC, and the other spy agencies in Canada about who has the right to do the spying. Prior to 2006, the RCMP actually did a lot of InfoSec in Canada. After 2006, CSEC, as it's known today, basically took over. And so you had this interesting split in there that maybe is related to this. I can't prove it, but that happens to fit that time frame. So that's interesting. The RCMP doesn't show up in the data set at all after 2006 on any measure. So that's interesting. Comments. Again, RCMP really involved around 2006, drops off. We see that gap between 2006, 2010, and then we see some NRC and Environment Canada work. Incidentally, the story that I told of the gentleman dealing with the vendors, he was interviewed at one of the agencies on this graph. I promised I wouldn't reveal which one, but you can guess for yourselves. And votes, who's involved? So there's not a lot of votes, but we see 7 votes at Employment and Social Development Canada. Did we see them on any previous graphs? No, so maybe that's another one who's like, hey, fix this for us. We're not gonna do anything, but fix this for us. That's interesting. So finally, what happened post-2010? Everything government in the data set drops off. All of the agencies, there was nothing between 2010 and 2012. I'd like to see, I don't have the data for 2013 to present, but I'd like to see if it comes back up. What happened in 2010? Harper won a majority and immediately announced Shared Services Canada, which was to consolidate all IT services for all government agencies into a single building of support. Guess who got the contract for Shared Services Canada? Bell Canada and a consortium. Do you think Bell Canada and their consortium are interested in open source in the slightest? So all the people who were involved in open source either got transferred to Shared Services Canada and were put under the thumb of Bell Canada, or they retired. And so you see no data after that. That's also really interesting. So what's gonna happen in the present with mobile, with Elections Canada suddenly doing interesting stuff? Did you follow the election night reporting? They did some interesting stuff again. I'm not bitter. I'll tell you stories later. That's what beer is for, to tell you the Election Canada scars. All right, enough about that. What about the long tail? So there's a few groups in the long tail. The first group is enterprise. They're the Bell Canadas of the world, the MTS All Streams, the large contract bidders in Canada. They largely do government contracts, but they also get universities and so on and so forth. They're the ones that the US government blames when opensource.org or opendata.org or whatever that open government site was falls apart, the CGIs. We have those in Canada too, and they're just as bad. Trust me, I worked with them. So you see these guys showing up. What's their game? They want to be able to win RFPs, requests for proposals. And one way to do that is to have more skills listed on the proposals. Listing open source competencies allows them to win more RFPs. So that's part of their game in being involved there. The insider perspective is talking about what happened inside these large enterprise organizations after the stock market crash. A lot of these organizations had exclusive contracts where they didn't really have to be competitive. And then suddenly you have these various disruptors coming from different sources, and the organization started panicking, and the groups had to compete inside those enterprises. So suddenly they looked at open source and said, hey, look, we can compete by not having to spend half our budget by giving it to Microsoft for licenses. So inside these organizations, in order to improve their RFP, there was a culture of maybe we need to stop shunning this open source stuff so that we can make sure that we don't lose our group and get fired, which happened a lot. We've seen massive layoffs in these organizations across Canada. So that's interesting as well, the culture in there. So this quote, I won't read it to you, is from a gentleman working in an enterprise organization. The second group is small and medium enterprises, which is self-subsets into 2 groups. You have the lone IT guy who is well known in open source communities who wants to scratch an itch. He's got a problem that he's got to keep running. He's got 20 users and keeps their computers running and so on, and he will use open source where appropriate to get that done. The second group is entrepreneurs, and these are people who are saying, hey, look, open source may be able to give me a competitive advantage because I'm not wasting money on licensing. That's great. How can we build a business model around that? So here's an example of an interview about scratching an itch, what that looks like, how it can be very different in open source than commercial off-the-shelf software. I won't read it to you guys because you guys are sold on that. You know how that works already. That's for a business audience who doesn't know what COTS is. The entrepreneurs, they're the ones who look in what's going on in open source communities and they say, hey, there's opportunities to move around what these open source products can do. And I don't have to rewrite them from scratch. I can just add a business application. And if that business application is open source, and I sell it to businesses that aren't software businesses, it doesn't matter, because they're not going to become software businesses. So I don't need to protect that IP. It makes no difference. I can still make a revenue stream. So that's interesting. This is what they look like in the data set. So we see some Bell Canada, some Nanometrics, Air Canada. That's interesting. Were they fixing bugs in Firefox for their booking system that's terrible? Who knows? But Air Canada's in there. We see the old Nortel, Ubisoft, doing stuff with gaming. That's really interesting, especially with HTML5 stuff. That's kind of cool. So these are the bigger firms. Bug reports, what are they doing? Well, we see a couple outliers there. Turns out there's a select few people who do a whole lot of stuff, and then there's a lot of long tail. We knew that. So within the long tail, there are exceptional jumps. These are people who are entrepreneurs who have a history in open source communities who are doing a lot. They do a lot of bug reports. They do a lot of activities. This is the same graph at a different scale, so you can see just how much more they do activities than other users. So the colors are the same people over time. They do a lot of comments, a lot more than the other users. Again, some people really eclipse others. This gentleman here has the top comments in the database, period, for Canadian users. And you can see totally a different order of magnitude in terms of the involvement of other people in the long tail. That's cool. Who is this person or who is this organization? I'm not sure, because that's too fine-grained. There's no website, interestingly, at this address. So maybe that's lost to history. Maybe we need to dig around in archive.org and see how this works out. But you can see that there's different involvements in there. Patches, same thing. Some people are patching a lot more. Follows, same thing. Some people are very interested in what other people are doing, others not so much. Votes, it's a bit more balanced. So sum up, we have itches, we have strategies to be more competitive in enterprise, and where's that going? Well, I'm curious to see especially what happens with Firefox OS. So Mark Sermon talked about how Firefox OS hasn't really worked out the way Mozilla had hoped, and that makes me sad. But I want to see what that looks like in the data. So most Firefox OS stuff happened after the end of 2012, and so I want to get at the Bugzilla dump from more recently, which is currently in lockdown because they're afraid of security problems, other discussions, to see what's going on with that. So are there business models happening around Firefox OS that we don't know about? That would be really cool. So I think that's where the future is. Lastly, before we jump to questions, you told a lot of really interesting stories there, but is it statistically valid? And you know what? That's what R is about at the end of the day. It's not just pretty graphs. So this is what the Bugzilla database looks like until the end of 2012. There are 774,000 bugs. Now we know it's up to, what, about 1.3 million, something like that. It's almost doubled since then. So there's a lot of stuff that we haven't captured over the past 3 years. 500,000 users approximately 10 million activities. Canadian ones, we see approximately 5,500 bugs, 2,600 users making up 1,400 orgs, and so on and so forth. You can see some of the summary statistics of what that looks like. I took a look at some measures, such as, can we tell if there's a difference in terms of how long bugs stay open across the types of organizations? So what I'm asking is, can universities or colleges or government or organizations resolve bugs faster than each other or less quickly than each other? Is there a pattern in there? Turns out the answer is yes, both in terms of the number of days open and the probability of the number of days open being below or above a certain threshold, which are various statistical blabby ways of measuring significance. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. In this case, you'll see that there are only 4 groups listed. They're relative to college as the base one. So all of these are probabilities relative to colleges, so that we get a sense from the Seneca audience. What about the probability of it getting fixed or not getting fixed? So there's a lot of bugs that end up as rejected, won't fix, or duplicate, or other statuses like that. Which ones get resolved with a fixed status, as in something productive happens out of it. Turns out colleges, which are mostly Seneca, are really good at that. Universities are terrible at that. And SMOs, small, medium organizations, are in between. Government's also not so great at that. Enterprise and colleges are actually the most similar. So that means Seneca is performing as well or better than the large enterprise organizations in Canada in terms of time of resolution of bugs and probability of a successful bug resolution. That's cool. And they're embarrassing the universities and they're embarrassing government and small and medium organizations in that respect. Is it statistically significant? Yes, it is. This is a very, very, very small subset of the tests that I'm doing in the larger branch. Imagine this expanded for all organizations globally. That's what the next branch will be. Come back next year, FSOSS 2016, and I'll tell you the global. Preliminarily, it is absolutely statistically significant and really fascinating what some of those organizations are doing. To sum it up, there's a tale of 5 organizations in Canada: universities, colleges, government departments, small and medium organizations, and enterprise organizations. They have different motivations to participate in open source, and they get different things out of it. There are some stars in each one, but their environment, we now have a good contextual understanding of it, and using R and analyzing the giant Bugzilla database instead of pulling out little queries in the terrible Bugzilla interface that we know is very difficult to use, gives us a beautiful visual representation of what that looks like on the big scale. And that's what I wanted to show you today so you can get a sense of the Canadian environment. Thank you very much. I welcome questions. Yes, sir.
Have you considered measuring like bug report data from organizations other than Mozilla?
So the question was, other than Mozilla, have I considered measuring other stuff? My good friend Andrea Ross at Eclipse is currently giving as much beer as possible to the person who has the finger on the Bugzilla database at Eclipse. And I'm hoping to get access to that data soon. It's surprisingly difficult to convince people to give you access to their data, even if it's open source and even if they have an API to access it. So I've considered it, but I haven't had a lot of success. If you have access to that data and you know people I should buy beers for to get access to that data, please let me know. Did you have something else to add?
Yeah, I was just wondering like how much of it could be just scraped from the webpage itself.
So to give you a context of the size of the database, it's 8 gigabytes of CSV. To scrape that from the Bugzilla portal would be a DDoS attack effectively. So it's not practical to scrape it through the APIs without totally destroying their servers. The type of analysis that I'm doing is on the whole database, and I actually hold it all in RAM to do the matrix computations, which is pretty cool. You can't do that through APIs. It's just not possible. The CompuStat database that I'm using right now, which allows me to link the organization's performance in open source with their stock market price, their revenue, their number of sales, their cost centers, all that data that's published at the Security Exchange Commission, that database is somewhere in the order of 50 gigabytes. And so I was able to pull that from a server somewhere, but you can't siphon that. And so the interactions of the two are just way too large to screen scrape. That's the nature of my research. For different types of research, you absolutely can do it, but not the way I am. Someone else had a question? Yeah?
So, with the sample size so small, I guess you could have some privacy concerns, although most people don't think contributing bug reports is something they need to keep private. But have you thought about that?
Absolutely.
Normal way of handling statistical things without damaging privacy is aggregating to things that are no smaller than, let's say, 50.
I'm aware. Yeah. So the question was about privacy concerns in this data. So it was addressed 3 ways. One, when I made the request to Mozilla, we went through a policy procedure that they have to validate this, and it was agreed at the highest levels of Mozilla that the data that I'm using is actually public. And so there's no expectation of privacy in the users that are contributing to this, and it's part of the user submission agreement that it's public. So already there's no expectation of privacy. The second way this was validated is that I tried to aggregate at the organization level. You're right that in some cases when there's very small, that could identify certain users, such I mentioned David Humphreys at Seneca. But by and large, certainly beyond the Canadian subset, it's very difficult to identify individual users. And the third way is that this went through the ethics review committee at York, who looked at it and they issued an okay that this was ethically appropriate. So that was absolutely considered and handled. Of course.
Right. Are you using any theoretical framework to make sense of that data.
Absolutely am. So if you look at my FSOSS presentation from 2014, I bring the whole theoretical framework and put it in there. I didn't put it back up today because it's too much information, but go look at the 2014 slides. The theoretical framework is essentially in business. We have what we call the knowledge-based view of the firm, which is the idea, the old closed source idea is that to protect your business model, you have to keep all your knowledge inside the organization. And if it spills over, your competitive advantage is destroyed. That's a business theory. And it's the closest business theory we have to understand open source, which gives you an idea of how old and archaic business theories are. So I've used this theory to essentially say, selectively revealing certain knowledge outside of organization boundaries will bring you back knowledge that you could not have created yourself in that organization. And the way I describe that is, you put a bug report out there, you're saying, hey, me at this organization, I have this problem that I need to fix. Your competitors suddenly find out that you have this problem, but then you might get back useful information in the form of a bug fix that someone has helped you resolve that problem. We call that solution knowledge, and that can enable your competitive advantage. Interestingly, if you manipulate this strategically, you can actually induce your competitors to follow you and do more of what you're doing. And when someone is following you, you are necessarily the leader. So you can do really interesting things strategically to force people to follow you in the market. And that's where I'm really interested in Firefox OS. For example, the partnership with Panasonic. What are LG and Samsung doing about that? I'm really curious. What are Apple and Google doing about that? I'm really curious. So there's interesting things in there about, from a theoretical perspective, how does the knowledgeful effect strategy in this organization? Very good question. You must be a business scholar. Do we have any more time, or are we out of time? I think we're out of time. I'll have private conversations afterwards. I'd be delighted to. Thank you very much.